Hope Deferred, Part 2. "Ah, yes, my lady, come to see the house," said a kind, busy, mothering voice, and Susan hastily uncovered her eyes. "Why, my dear, what's the matter?" Susan became aware of cool air hitting streaks on her cheeks and hastily wiped away the water. "I was once here as a girl," she explained. The plump housekeeper had hair pulled back in a much messier gray bun than Mrs. McGreedy would ever have worn. "Forgive me, my dear, but I don't recall children being here," she said. "The man before these owners was an old bachelor professor, and you'd be too young for the man before him." Intelligent, Susan realized, smiling a bit ruefully. She would have to explain a bit more. "I came here with my siblings, 3 of them, during the war. Professor Diggory Kirk took us in." "Oh, the war children," said Mrs. Richards. "Why, my dear, I've heard the stories. They say you quite brought the old professor out of his books and back into the real world with your visit here. Took him to the creek in the woods and dunked him in by accident, they told me. Him, an old man, and still recreating battle scenes with your brothers. He came back soaking wet, white hair plastered to his face, and the boys helping him along. 9 days' wonder in the village and all that, even as eccentric as I heard he was. Let me see, the younger one was fair-haired and laughing, they said. So you must be the older one. Susan, wasn't it?" "Yes, Susan Pevensey." "There now, that's nice and proper. Come back to see the old place again?" "Yes, ma'am, if it's not too much trouble. And could you please send word to Jeremy that I'll be visiting the house for a little while?" "Why, no trouble at all. You know most of the things about it, I shouldn't wonder. But we'll go through and you can have a look at the old place just the same. Perhaps you'll tell me some of the stories as well." Mrs. Richards opened the door to the hall, one the dependencies had not run down, for it was too close to the servants' quarters. Susan smiled. Susan did end up telling stories to Mrs. Richards. They were too powerful, too present not to be told. There was the suit of armor Peter and Edmund had ended up taking apart. And when the professor had found them at it, they'd shown him the various differences between dwarf make and English. Not that she mentioned that last part to Mrs. Richards, of course. And Mr. Kirk sat on that chest there and asked intelligent questions, and Peter and Edmund ended up debating the various strengths and weaknesses of both, till a giggling Ivy had found them and reminded them that being half an hour late for supper was not conducive to the peace of the house, as she says. "Professor, begging your pardon." There stood the painting Susan had sought to recapture and even improve, and Peter, not watching where he was going, had run headlong into her and the paint, creating a mess. The 4 of them cleaned it up before the maids noticed. But yes, there was still the tiniest bit of blue on the back of the original painting's frame that they had never been able to clean out. The housekeeper laughed so hard she sat down on a nearby chair, telling her the servants had noticed that blue spot and taken to telling much wilder tales of how it got there in this strange, adventurous house. One of the servants, Sarah, had sworn it was all that was left of a secret message that had warned stowaways of approaching enemy soldiers, and the rest of the servants teased her, telling her painting secret messages in bright blue was a perfect way to make sure they weren't noticed. Get off of it! So many stories, so many rooms, so many passages. Everywhere, her siblings, all 3 of them, young and living, and nothing she could touch or call to. Nothing she could be loved by. But finally they went into the narrow passage leading to the empty room, the passage which filled with woven tapestries now, though nothing like the beautiful, colorful Narnian ones. And then Mrs. Richards' hand was on a knob. The door was opening more, and she could see the room, and they went in. And Susan nearly tripped over the rolled-up carpet on the floor. "This room is just storage now," said Mrs. Richards, "but I thought you might have played in here. A nice empty space it was." "Where's the wardrobe?" said Susan, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips and fear choking her throat. "Where's the wardrobe?" "A wardrobe?" Oh, yes, that's right. I remember it now. It was a handsome old thing filled with fur coats and mothballs. Let's see. It was gone before my time, but Mrs. McGreedy told me about it. She was the housekeeper before my time. It was something the professor made, I think, from an apple tree he had in his childhood. A large one with a looking glass in the door. Yes, that's the one, said Susan. Where is it? I don't know, my dear. Gone before my time. It means much to you, doesn't it? How could Susan possibly explain how much? How could she explain the need that devastated her when left unmet? Could she ever find it? Where had it gone? Well, my dear, I've nowhere to send you, but please, Mrs. Richards, it meant so much to my brothers and sister and I when we were here. It held our whole world inside it. Bigger on the inside, the mystery none of them had known how to explain. Someplace safe after the bombs of London, said Mrs. Richards. Kindness was in her tone again, the kindness that met Susan everywhere and still wasn't enough to touch the hole where she lost everything. Well, I can tell you nothing, but Mrs. McCready was the kind of housekeeper who knew everything, and I don't think she'd mind me giving you her address. She's 2 stops over on the train back towards London. She's not far from the station. She's the sort that will get around, do things as long as she's still walking, and she'll still be walking as long as she's alive. She's in a big brown apartment lodging. You can see it from a platform to the left of it. I still go up sometimes, and she quizzes my memory on all the things in the house and makes sure I've gotten them right. Old enough to be your mother I am, and not much younger than her, but I still feel a child in her presence. But it pleases her, and it helps me to make sure somebody still remembers all of this. She might know where the wardrobe went. Thank you, said Susan. You want to go now and find that wardrobe, don't you, dear? Yes, Mrs. Richards. Jeremy won't have left yet. He's sweet on one of the maids, and good for her. He's the kind of man that would make a good husband for any woman. He can drive you back, and you'll be in time for the 2:05 train. Come, let's be off. Susan didn't see much of the house on the way down, listening to the thud of her heart, which seemed to ask, where, and trying not to cry. Kindness was quite upsetting, and she'd been given much of it here. Mrs. Richards sent a maid for Jeremy, asking him to hook his horse up again. He had stayed. And then the housekeeper settled Susan into a chair into one of the front rooms with a handkerchief and a cup of tea while they waited. Susan, in thanks, told her a few more stories till the wagon came rumbling into sight in the window, and Susan set aside her cup of tea and stood. She held out her hands to Mrs. Richards, who more slowly and lumberingly stood. Mrs. Richards took them in her own, squeezing them gently and firmly. Thank you, said Susan. Thank you. Truly you have the kindness of the heart of a lion. I cannot thank you enough for it. Why, that's a strange thing to say, and yet I've never had a nicer compliment, said Mrs. Richards. There, now, take care. I'll see you not. Down you go. Goodbye and good luck. Susan pulled up into the wagon by Jeremy's hand as he nodded a greeting, sat on the seat, and twisted to wave goodbye to Mrs. Richards till she was out of sight. The trip back to the station was another quiet one, as Susan's nerves had settled somewhat with the tea. Jeremy spoke a little about the maid he had been seeing. He said she was having a rough day, what with a party coming in 2 days and all the chairs needing polishing. Susan smiled and listened, and said little until they were back in the town. Jeremy helped her down, and the station master, still at his post, reached down to help her up the stairs to the platform. She turned on it back to Jeremy. It's not my place, but if you would allow me the freedom, we passed by a lovely field of flowers on the way here. If you wanted to take some to one of the maids back at the house, I think you might make her day much better. Much obliged, miss. That's a grand idea, said Jeremy, tipping his hat. Susan smiled, turned to the station master, bought her ticket gracefully, and retreated to a safe distance away so the 2 men could talk comfortably. She had bought a ticket for 2 stops away.